Okay. Study of the divine teaching. There is no doubt that humanity is obligated to study the divine teaching of the Noahide laws, which comes down from Sinai with its commentary, in order to be able to perform these laws. Well, I mean, so that's the obvious part. You have to study the 7 laws in order to know how to keep and carry them out. So that's, and perform them. So that's obvious. In other words, there can't be a 7 laws without there being an implicit, an implied command to study them. Because if you don't study them, how are you going to carry them out? It doesn't make sense. You don't know what they are, then how can you perform them? How can you keep them? So that's a given. So obviously you have to study them and all their details in order to properly keep them. So that's a given. Next sentence. Within this study, there is also study in depth and with analysis of these laws. So in parentheses, he says, so as to give their performance deeper meaning and intent. So this is another avenue which is not as implicit, but at the same time rational. And that is that the study, you should study any portion related to the laws that will enhance their performance and deepen their meaning and the intent in performing them. So, I mean, clearly, if one of the objectives of the Noahide laws is to perfect human beings, their character, and to bring them closer to God, then that's also, in that case, that implies that they should be studied in a way where they make a deeper imprint on the person and that they encourage deeper intent, right? Because that brings a person closer to God through the performance of the commandments, and also it helps enhance the person's character. So take a look at this. So there's 2 interesting things here. First of all, from this flows out one of the most, how should I say, one of the most strict and severe elements of Noahide law, and that is that if someone who is a Ben Noach doesn't know the law, they're still punished. It's very much kind of like in the secular system. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. The same rule under the 7 commandments. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. You can't claim you didn't know. I mean, most of them, I guess part of it is because they're so fundamental and so rational that everyone needs to know it, should know it, and should be obvious to most people. Again, I mean, to a certain extent, it may be assuming a little bit of a different world in which some of these things would be such a given, and in a world where they're not, as we live in today, this may not be the case. But nevertheless, generally speaking, obviously what? Murder, but even idolatry, there's something in us as human beings that tells us, that there's something wrong with that. But again, if someone's brought up in a society where they don't know it's wrong, where they're brought up with it, that might be an excuse where even though generally the person is said to know better, they may not be deemed to know better. But in any event, the point is this. The point is, what do we see from the fact that there's a rule that a Ben Noach is obligated to have studied, and if he didn't study, it's his own fault, and therefore is punished for unintentional wrongdoing. Unintentional meaning to say things that he didn't know were forbidden, he or she. So you see there's an obligation to study, a very, very serious and severe, or a very heavy obligation to study, where it's so strong that it really develops into a punishment, meaning to say, you're punished for not studying, basically. If you're punished for unintentional, for things that you're ignorant of, but you're still punished, that basically means you're being punished for the fact that you didn't study and you didn't find it out. So therefore, studying is extremely serious. It's not, an extra. It's not fluff. Everybody with me? Okay. Now take a look at this. So first of all, in footnote 47, he quotes Maimonides saying exactly that about unintentional wrongdoing, or I should say again, ignorant wrongdoing out of ignorance, a violation of the 7 laws out of ignorance. So he quotes the language, it was incumbent upon him to learn. You see, he needed to study and find it out. That's his obligation. So in a certain sense, this obligation is an umbrella that is fundamental to all the 7. It's kind of like, it's almost like it's the common denominator underneath the 7. It's like 7 over 1 or something. 1 is the study. The study is the key. Without the study, you don't have the 7, or I should say you can't, you end up violating the 7 without the study. So study is very, very important. Because usually as we approach we talk about the 7 commandments, usually we say, well, if someone studies, they're like a high priest. Someone occupies himself in the Torah of the 7 laws like a high priest. But that's not really the whole story, is it? I mean to say that doesn't bring out the whole severity and seriousness of it. So in other words, what we see is it can bring you as high as to be a high study, can bring you all the way up to being like a high priest, or all the way down to the bottom to being executed for capital crimes, for a failure to study. That's study is from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. The failure to study can bring a person down to the lowest pit, and studying can bring a person to the highest heights. All right, let's see footnote 48. This dimension takes one also to the study of the Talmud with its commentaries. So listen to this. So there's it sounds like that there's an obligation for a Ben Noach to study the Talmud and its commentaries in relation to their laws. It would seem that the Lubavitcher Rebbe concurs with those who state that this can apply to the study of Noahide laws. And he cites Likutei Sichos, which is the collection of discussions of the Rebbe, volume 27, page 247. And also footnote 84 there. This is a view of the Meiri, unlike the view of the Maharsha cited there in the Talmud. In the same footnote in the Shalos HaTshuvas Machne Chaim, cited to the effect that only when the study is with depth and analysis is a human being considered occupied in Torah, to warrant the comparison with the high priest of the Jewish people stated in Talmud tractate Sanhedrin. So in other words, in order to come to the level where we say that one of the Noahide community is like a high priest for occupying themselves in Torah, according to the Machne Chaim, yes, that means that he's occupied through pilpul in-depth analysis of Torah, which usually basically comes from Talmudical study. So it's not wrong. It's not unusual. It's not he's not exactly saying it's an obligation, but we're saying it's not like an extra. Again, it's not something extra. It's not something unusual. It actually is something as praiseworthy as what the Tana de Be'eliyahu discusses when it says that Ben Noach, not the Tana de Be'eliyahu, but what the Talmud says in the name of Rabbi Meir, that a non-Jew that occupies himself with Torah, i.e. his Torah, is like a high priest. This is talking about the deep analysis and in-depth study similar to Talmudical study. If we continue the footnote, he says, see also Sefer Asara Mamoros, Lak Set, which associates an obligation to be occupied with the study of the Noahide laws as part of the general commandment relating to the reverence for God. And that's, I guess, why it's in this chapter, because occupying oneself with the study of the Noahide laws is a manifestation of reverence for God. Basically the idea is the more reverence you have for God's word, the more work you put into understanding it. The less you care about it, the less you're interested in knowing what it really, really means. And the more that you study it, the more toil you put into study it, the more precious you show that it is to you. Right? Okay.
Rabbi, may I ask a question here?
Yeah.
I was in a discussion with another rabbi about that I would like to study Talmud. I've never gotten into it, but would like to do that. And he discouraged me from doing that on my own. He said it would be like walking through a minefield without a map, and that on my own, it would not be a good idea. So does what we're reading here in this, does this mean that if I wanted to study Talmud, I would need to study under a rabbi, or is it okay just to read it on my own?
Well, I don't think that this footnote addresses your question at all. It's talking about studying in depth on a level and in a form or method similar to the Talmud. And it also discusses actually studying Talmud, the Noahide laws relating to the Talmud relating to the Noahide laws. How to go about doing that? What's the proper method of Talmudic study? It doesn't say anything here about that. However, I could say that if you're studying the Talmud from a reliable Orthodox translation and commentary, it's like having a teacher. I think that it could be, there will be certain elements of study you may miss out on. For example, in other words, in order to learn the method of studying Talmud without assistance, usually studying from a book, you may never get there, because it's kind of like walking with crutches. And so you never, or riding a bicycle with training wheels, and you never take off your training wheels. So similarly, studying, for example, from an art scroll Talmud, it's hard to graduate from that to just studying Talmud without an art scroll commentary. However, the chances of studying a Talmud, an art scroll commentary, and making a mistake in understanding the meaning of the text or coming out with a heretical view of something, it's highly unlikely. You're getting everything, with the rabbinical Orthodox stamp on it, with it clearly explained in English. So it depends what the point is, the idea of a minefield. If you're studying Talmud yourself, with only an English translation, with no commentary, and not an art scroll, but some of the older versions that are simply translations, then I would say yes, a minefield. You just may not really understand what you're saying, for one thing. But I think with something like an art scroll or with the Steinsaltz Talmuds, I don't know really, I think the chances of you coming to a wrong conclusion, I think, are highly unlikely, personally. I don't see any problem doing it. You're just not going to become a Talmudical scholar, meaning, you're not going to be able to come into a yeshiva, pull out, a Talmud just in the Aramaic and read it and understand it from studying the art scroll versions, because you're always kind of being told what everything means in English. So you're not studying solely out of the way we studied in the yeshivas was you're thrown into the fire, where you only have the Hebrew, and you have to listen to your teacher as he explains the meaning of the Hebrew words. And over a long time, many, many hours every day for years, it finally sinks in, what the words mean, and the expressions and the phrases and the nuances after a long time of listening. But when you have a translation and a commentary, everything in English, so you're basically operating in English. You're not going to be able to then, drop everyone's jaw and walk into a synagogue one day and pull out a Talmud in Hebrew, and they're like, what is going on? I don't know if that'll happen if you have the art scroll, but you're not going to make any big boo-boos, though. You're not going to really, make any big mistakes. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Very helpful.
That's my approach. I don't know, I think it's rational. I think it makes sense.
Okay.
Somebody, Kyle, let's see, has there ever been compiled a list of Talmud sections that applies to? See, that is actually a really good question, Kyle. Do we know the sections that apply to Noahide? I don't think we have it. I don't know there is a way to do it though. And that is if you go to Maimonides, if you go to the chapters, there's like one or two chapters in which Maimonides discusses, the Noahide laws. And then you look at the commentaries on Rambam who bring the Talmudical statements, then you can go backwards. You can go from Maimonides back to the sources and then go look at the sources in the Talmud and so on. So that could be one way to do it. The other way is to just simply figure it out by topic. In other words, we've discussed this many times. Like if you wanted to know about idolatry, there's a whole Masechta on idolatry, which is not even studied in mainstream yeshivas. But there's plenty of commentary on it. Masechta Avodah Zarah, for those of you with the Israeli accent. That's one. So that's one that clearly it's relevant to Bnei Noah. Clearly, basically what you do is you take each one of the laws and say, hey, which Masechet discusses these laws? Masechet Sanhedrin will have a lot of things also very much related to Noah because it talks about capital crimes, which include, forbidden sexual unions, which include idolatry, which include blasphemy, will all be discussed in Sanhedrin. The question is where? I don't know it well enough to answer that question exactly. But in one of there are chapters that talk about those here. They list the people, those who get capital punishment in different forms, and so you can go in that way and maybe find. But to answer your question, Kyle, in one word, the answer is no. It would be helpful. It's a good point. Okay. All right. Let's continue on page 205. But this is really. This is actually incredible. This footnote 48 is really a game changer. It's really, something we didn't know. And obviously, because of the whole approach, like on one hand, and again, I just want to make this clear so everyone understands this. On the one hand, Torah that is not relevant to the non-Jew shouldn't be studied, particularly on a Talmudical level. You can know the laws, read it in the Bible, but to study in that depth and it's not related, it's Israelite laws, that's really a big no-no. That's really something that you're not supposed to do. However, Noahide law, you are allowed to, and here we're saying you actually should. We're actually saying it's extremely praiseworthy for you to do so and to occupy yourself with understanding those laws. So it's really surprising. I think many Jews probably, would think that, yeah, but that's kind of like, this is something very private. The whole Talmudical method of study that non-Jews should be exposed to it. It seems you'd think that this is something that we would say, no, you shouldn't be. But he's saying yes, meaning to say there are many views of very solid authorities that say that a Ben Noah, that the nations who are adherents to the seven laws should study it, and they should study in depth on a Talmudical level. And actually, the Lubavitcher Rebbe seems to apply this to Noahide laws expressly. It's also the view of one of the great medieval authorities, the Meiri. Seems that there's a difference of opinion on it. But anyway, it's all in this footnote 48, so you can review it and check it out. Different views, but clearly occupying, which means that studying it in depth with analysis is extremely praiseworthy and fits the statement of Rabbi Meir that a non-Jew who does so is like a high priest. So, okay. Now, I guess what I'm saying is, what if you're delving in depth into the laws, but not in a Talmudical way, but you're studying, other books, maybe in an academic approach. You're studying it in depth, with legitimate, Orthodox rabbis. It may be they're from Yeshiva University, and they've written, academic articles, and, deep, that discuss Noahide law. That's also, the point is, I'm just saying, there may be different approaches to studying in depth and with analysis. And, when you're thinking about it deeply, based on reliable Orthodox traditional sources, maybe that's also in depth. I don't know if you have to study Talmud for it to be considered in depth, is what I'm saying. Okay, page 205. There is a further level in the study of the Noahide laws undertaken not simply to know how to perform the ethical imperatives optimally, but to know the divine wisdom in relation to the Noahide law itself. What does this mean? This kind of study of the divine law is portrayed in the description of the times of the redemption of humanity and creation as the occupation of the entire world being solely to know God alone. And that again is from the Maimonides, the end of his Mishnah Torah, Hilchos Malachim, chapter 12, law, rule 5. And at the end of days, in the Messianic age, that all peoples will study the knowledge of God. So, in other words, I think what he's saying is, which is, well, like we said at the beginning, let's read the first sentence again and try to understand it a little bit better. He's saying there is a further level of the study of the Noahide laws undertaken not simply to know how to perform the ethical imperatives optimally, but to know the divine wisdom itself. In other words, what's the divine wisdom that is the essence, the core behind the Noahide law? What is it? What is the divine will? What is the divine secrets and knowledge that from which flows these rules? What is that? So again, we'll go to some footnotes and see if it's helpful at all. Number 49 is esoteric and not so clearly helpful, but maybe well worth looking at. So a further level of study, says in footnote 49, namely the study of the Torah relating to what is termed the crown of Torah. What does that mean? I think we're talking about some mystical, what's the word I should say? We're talking about a mystical layer here, or we're talking about the deeper layers. Besides, in other words, besides the mechanics of what to do and what not to do, but what is the underpinnings of it? What is both the understanding, the meaning, the secrets, the divine knowledge? In other words, I'll put it to you this way. If these laws would be translated in a spiritual way, if you'd be studying them in the Garden of Eden, what would we be talking about? It sounds kind of high up there, right? I mean, but the point is that, again, this is something you can see from Hasidic teachings, but there's a Torah here in this world, but the secrets on which these laws are based come from a spiritual place. They come from a spiritual and divine reality. So those secrets, those meanings, that essence, that can be studied too and should be studied. So that's pretty deep there. And that's the knowledge of God. What's the knowledge of God? And how do the laws reflect the knowledge of God? So there's a knowledge of God in which reflects God's will for man. God wants us to do this, God wants us to do that, and so on and so forth. But there's another level, and that is that this is God's will coming from his very essence. It's kind of like, I can know my parent in terms of the way that parent, like the way they brought me up. Don't do this, don't talk over your parent, don't eat with your hands, et cetera, whatever it may be. So thank you, say thank you, don't hit your brother. That's one level of knowing your parent. But there's another level of like, what is your parents' character that all that came from? Like, what do they really stand for? And when you know that, then you can apply your parents' views, worldview to any situation. It's not just the things they told you, but anything. And you can live, in other words, your mind becomes, and maybe your heart as well, becomes like your parent, or your greatest teacher, or your greatest mentor. It's not, you have to know them so well and know their opinions so well that you understand the meaning and the theme, how shall I say, the fundamental principles of their life, of what they stand for, of the way they perceive things. And so it's not just do this, do that, do that, do this, but you get it from a deeper level. For example, let's say the meaning of their life is, to be a giver, not a taker. I mean, just to simplify, to uphold justice, to give everyone their due. I don't know, just some examples of things that are just fundamental principles that someone may stand for. So similarly, that's the difference between, knowing the rule book, but knowing what's beyond, but what's underneath, what's the underpinning of the rule book? What's underneath the rule book? Obviously in this case, when you talk about God, you're talking about something much beyond that, but it's similar in that, for example, in a person, all their behaviors may stem from a deep feeling of empathy, for example, a deep feeling of an overflowing of kindness, and that kindness gets imbued in you and you feel that love. And that, so instead of just rules, but you have this essence, this deep essence of what everything means, and then everything flows like a stream from that, so anyway, I can't even really give this justice, because how can we really understand this? I mean, how can we talk about the knowledge of God? How can we really know God? Of course, the answer is we can only know in terms of how he reveals himself in the world. But that itself has to be understood, by the way. For example, how do we understand human events, or I should say world or natural events, or whatever it is? You have to have the right lens to understand what you're seeing, right? And that is part of it, part of what it means to have the knowledge of God. There's something Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Nachman says some just amazing things. I know I'm a Lubavitcher, but I've been introduced to some teachings of Rabbi Nachman Breslov, and it's quite really powerful and quite interesting. One of the things that he talks about is how a person should have a perception of life, always have in mind that the end, or I should put it this, always have in mind the world to come. You should look at the world with the lens of the world to come. I mean, it's incredibly powerful and profound. Meaning to say, because the things that happen to us, I mean, we look at them in a certain, let's just, for example, I'll give you an example. And it shouldn't happen to anyone because we want only good, but let's say somebody loses a lot of money, right? So it's frustrating. The person's really, the natural human reaction would to be angry, frustrated, get very down and depressed. But from the perspective of the world to come, the person might have just the opposite reaction. They may see this as an opportunity for atonement. They may see this as an opportunity to become more bereft of worldly things, to divest themselves of worldliness. They may see this as a wake-up call for things that they may be doing wrong, right? That this was a means of God to shake them up about something. Totally different approach, a totally different view of the event. Really, actually, just completely in contrast to the first person, seeing it completely, while the first person saw the event as, God's harsh hand and why is this happening to me? Why this? Why that? The second person, on the other hand, sees it as a positive, and and sees that God's messaging. He's seeing the truth, really. He's seeing the truth that the first person doesn't see. So, and I think that has a lot to do with the idea of the knowledge of God. Is we have to be able to see the world as it truly is from God's perspective and what He wants from us, and then we can see, then you can really see things a lot differently. Anyway, I've gone a little bit afield here. Let's try to get back to this. But look, I think people should study Chassidus. I think people should study the parts of Chassidus, particularly that were recommended for the Bnei Noach, which are certain chapters of Tanya that talks about, the whole part that's called Shar HaYichud Ve'Emunah, which is God's unity. I mean, is the Rabbi used to encourage that everyone should study this. There's a lot of, I guess the question is, what other parts should people study? It's a good question. There's a funny story that I heard from a rabbi in Israel. He told the following story. He said, once upon a time, hundreds of years ago, at the beginning of the development of the Hasidic movement, there was a lot of opposition to Hasidism. And I don't know how many of you are interested in Hasidic studies. I don't know how much this is worth saying, but I guess I'll just say it anyway. So I think there's a profound idea here, so maybe it's worth hearing, even if you're not into Hasidic teachings. Anyway, so there was a young man. In those days, couples got married very early, very often. And there was a father with a young daughter, not even 20 years old yet, right? And married her to a young man, also a teenager. I don't know how old he was. Maybe he was 17. I don't know. Very young, maybe even young. Who knows? I don't know. They were a very young couple. And the idea was that this happened many times in Eastern Europe, that the boy would come and live with his father-in-law, and he would study Talmud and Torah and so on until he got older, and he would be supported in his father-in-law's house. Eat there, sleep there, you get all his needs from his father-in-law. The thing is, there was a condition, and that condition was that he would not study the teachings of the new Hasidic movement. Okay, they came to an agreement, and there was a wedding and everything. The young man, though, he was so taken with Hasidic thought that he broke this promise, and he began to study Hasidism. And eventually, his father-in-law found him out, and he told him, "Listen, I won't stand for this. You can't. I don't want you studying this. And listen, and we're gonna have to go to the rabbi. We'll go to the rabbi about it." Went to the rabbi. They actually entered into a halachic contract, in which stated that he's forbidden to study this, and if he does study this, that he will be removed from the home. He'll have to give his wife a get, etc., etc. It's all over. And it was co-signed by the rabbi, maybe held in the rabbinic office there. Sometime later, I assume it was at least a few months later, but eventually the young man, he couldn't help himself, and he began studying Hasidic studies again. And his father-in-law found out and sent him away from the home. And it's kind of a sad story. The story goes that the young man, he wandered, he was evidently an orphan or something, and he wandered from place to place, from synagogue to synagogue, without any support. And eventually he didn't have enough to eat, and was cold or whatever. Eventually he caught a sickness. He caught one of the sicknesses, maybe tuberculosis or something that was passing around in those times, and he passed away. So he came up to the heavenly court, and the heavenly court said to him, "He said to him, 'You're here already? You're here early. What are you doing here?' So he told him the whole story that he's studying Chassidus that his father-in-law didn't approve of, and they had an agreement. They sent him away, and then that unfortunately this is what happened. So the heavenly court said, we're calling the father-in-law. They called the father-in-law and told him the story. We had this agreement. He agreed, and it wasn't done with the rabbi, and the rabbi agreed with me, and we reduced it to writing, as they say in the law, and that's what happened. They called the rabbi, discussed with the rabbi, then again based on the father-in-law, their background and the rabbi's background, the heavenly court came to the conclusion that based on their upbringings, even though Hasidic teachings are good, but based on where they were coming from, they didn't do anything wrong, according to their knowledge and human, limitations. They didn't do anything wrong. So the only one who did something wrong was the young man who broke his word in the contract. He did something wrong. So the judgment was rendered against him. He has to go to Gehenna. So go to Gehinnom. And they're taking him down to Gehenna. He's being taken by the angels of the Malachi Chavala, they're called, the angels that cause pain and suffering and stuff like that. Anyway, he's being led to Gehinnom, and they pass by the chamber of the Messiah. Is where the neshama, the soul of the Mashiach is, and the Mashiach sees this young man's soul passing by, and he says, I want to talk to this young man. Anyway, a long story short, this is a long story. I'm getting into a long story here. We're getting away from our learning. And, I'll just get to the end of it, I guess, at the end of it. But anyway, he takes him in to his chamber, and the angels are waiting and waiting and waiting. And he says, I'm not letting him out. He's staying with me. He's one of my people. I'm not letting him go. So the Mashiach appears before the heavenly court, and he says to the heavenly court, he said, I was brought into this world for exactly these type of neshamot that are in conflict, that sometimes make mistakes. I've been brought into this world. That's my purpose is to redeem and to bring this. Well, and I'm going to I'm not going to allow this neshama to go to Gehenna. So in any event, I guess, what does this have anything to do with what I'm talking to? I guess basically what I'm coming to is that sometimes, you have to be bold in your study and seeking of spiritual things sometimes. And this young man, on one level, he did something wrong. And obviously it led to harsh consequences. But on another level, he did something that wasn't wrong. So anyway, I don't know if we can learn from such a story, because he did go against his word. But at the same time, I guess what I simply wanted to bring out, and I don't want to misunderstand from the story, is that it's important to have a boldness when it comes to spiritual things, and to seek out, knowledge of Hashem, when using a person's tremendous determination. Put it that way. Okay. So back to our paragraph. This kind of study of the divine law is portrayed in the description of the times of the redemption of humanity and creation as the occupation of the entire world being solely to know God alone. To understand as much as we can of how he reveals himself to the world and what God's about, if that's possible. This vision concludes with a verse from the prophet Isaiah, for the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the seabed. That's what the Maimonides quotes. This refers to the knowledge of the divine teaching of the Noahide laws in a manner which encompasses and permeates the being of humanity. Wow, that's pretty heavy. Next paragraph. At the same time, the ability to interpret and make new applications of the divine law is only accessed within the tradition of commentary as a whole, which comes down with the written law from Sinai. It has been given only to those who received the whole of the revelation at Sinai in its depth to engage in this aspect of study of the divine law. This is why humanity in general, which received a part of the law, the 7 Noahide laws, is not given or permitted to occupy itself with the analysis of the totality of the tradition, such as is required to present a new insights into or novel application of any aspect of the tradition, including Noahide law. So that's very fascinating. It's an interesting take. So what he's saying is giving an explanation as to why is it that a Noahide cannot add or innovate a law in his own laws. Why not? In fact, it's bound to happen. It's actually very hard to understand. We're saying two things that are contradictory. On the one hand, we said before that a Noahide should occupy themselves with Torah study in depth with analysis. On the other hand, we've said that the Noah community shouldn't add or innovate anything new, right? Come on, how can you really study with deep analysis and not come up with anything new, any new ideas? Well, for one thing, first of all, you could say that there's no problem with a new idea, it's just new practices that are not permitted. But even new practices, if someone's studying in depth and understands it well, why can't they add a new practice if it seems like it supports Noahide law? Right? So what he says here is the reason is that to really, in order to understand any part of the divine law properly, you have to know the whole thing. You have to be familiar with all in order to make sure you truly understand parts. In other words, unlike secular law, lahavdil, where it's highly specialized and you can be kind of ignorant in a lot of it and just specialize in one little part of it, we're saying you can't do that here. You have to be extremely knowledgeable in everything. I'll read it again. It has been given only to those who received the whole of the revelation at Sinai, including and beyond the Noahide laws, in its depth, to engage in this aspect of study of the divine law. This is why humanity in general, which received a part of the law, the 7 Noahide laws, is not given or permitted to occupy itself with the analysis of the totality of the tradition, such as is required to present new insights into or novel application of any aspect of the tradition, including Noahide law. Rather, the Noahide judge, as a learned individual, will study and apply clear-cut established rulings. Humanity is connected with the transcendent divine teaching, but at the same time is directed to the custodians of the tradition in its detail and depth as a whole for issues of new interpretation, application, and ruling. There's also a quote, it seems like it's many quotes from the Lubavitcher Rabbi. Take a look at footnote 56 on page 206. So first he quotes the Hebrew that from the Rambam that we don't allow for the nations to innovate new things in their religion or practice. But then he goes on to say, the Sefer Sheva Mitzvos Hashem, in the book of the 7 laws of Hashem, which meaning the 7 laws of Noah, states, however, that general humanity may acquire a general as distinct from an in-depth study of the entire Torah, such as to have an acquaintance with the Torah of the Jewish people. Okay, so obviously that goes to the written Torah, but the question is, would that apply also to the oral Torah? What do you mean they're allowed to study the entire Torah? So, but anyway, I think the last sentence is something that I've often said, is that the nation should be acquainted with the Torah of the Jewish people. You should know, basically what it's all about. And when I say basically it's all about, I don't mean just like, yeah, there's the Torah, enough said, period. No, I mean to say that, that there's a law of Peah, that there's the laws of Shemitah, that there's the laws of Teruma, that whatever it is, the laws of purity, you're entitled to know about that and even its details as it may relate to you or it may relate to your relationship with a Jew. As he says, as to have an acquaintance with the Torah of the Jewish people. So, it gets a little interesting to what point do you say, okay, this is too much. This isn't really relevant to, quote, having an acquaintance with the Torah of the Jewish people. So clearly not deep analysis. So deep analysis is clearly out. But the question is, for example, what about the study of the Mishnah, which is just the rulings, just the law of all things, for example, the purity laws. I mean, I don't know if anyone here is interested in that, but I'm just as an example, would you be permitted just to study those laws, just as quote, to have an acquaintance with the laws of the Jewish people? So I don't exactly know the answer to that, but certainly whatever it says in the written Torah about the laws of purity, you're entitled to know it and understand it, and so that you know that there's such a thing, and basics idea of how it's done, and so on. It's kind of like the idea of, let's say, you were a non-Jew living in Israel during a kingdom in which the Torah authority was being was the law of the land. You need to know all these things, even though if it doesn't necessarily apply to you. You need to know it. You need to know what's going on. You need to know what the laws of the land are, right? Okay, okay, I think that's it for tonight, because we're up to repentance, which is a whole other topic, and so there's a lot here, a lot here, and the paragraph on page 205 in regards to the divine wisdom is quite complicated, and it's profound. At the same time, it's not fully clear. Like, for example, he doesn't talk about mystical study, and so it takes a little bit of delving deeper to try to understand that paragraph and to understand what is it that he's referring to. It's very profound and deep. If you look back at 205, look at this last sentence in which he's talking about studying the Noahides' teachings as a knowledge of God. In other words, the inner meanings of the Noahide law. He says this refers to the knowledge of the divine teaching of the Noahide law in a manner which encompasses and permeates the being of humanity. How can we understand that sentence? It's a very powerful sentence. But what is it? What does he mean by that? So, again, I do think it has something to do with, and I guess we're not limiting it to mystical, but the idea is that there's the body and the spirit of the law. I think it's something like I mentioned before. There's the body, meaning the technical, mechanical aspect of it. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. And then there's the ideas and feelings and big themes and even things that are almost like poetry, feelings about the law and where it's coming from that are not, that encompass a person, that are what they call the spirit of the law, that to help it, that it comes, that it permeates and encompasses a person. And that's really, really important, extremely important, because a person has a heart and emotions and thoughts that are connected with emotion. And we can't, when a person just follows rules, but in their heart, they're not drawn to their way of living emotionally, then they can be easily tempted. They can be easily pulled to something else. It has to be internalized to them and be sweet to them and be meaningful in a deep way to them. And that's the kind of a teaching that is the divine teaching of the Noahide. Its depths in inner essence. So Hasidic teachings are one approach to that. There are also ethical teachings might work for people. Really, it's from person to person, but it's something that's really, really necessary. Also, studying of Tanakh, studying of the prophets. It's also a lot of what the prophets said was the spirit of the law. Just the idea of an ethic and a moral teaching, with not getting into its technicalities, but just an overarching idea and theme and philosophy. And that's also part of, I think, what he's talking about here.